There is a plant that Henry Ford grew on his private estate, specifically to power his automobiles. Not as a curious experiment for his personal amusement, not as a publicity stunt designed to generate newspaper headlines, not as a futuristic concept waiting for technology that did not yet exist to catch up with his imagination. Henry Ford, the man who single-handedly put America on wheels and revolutionized manufacturing forever, built a fully functional car in 1941, designed to run entirely on fuel made from this remarkable plant. He posed proudly for photographs next to this revolutionary vehicle. He demonstrated it enthusiastically to reporters from major newspapers across the country. He called it nothing less than the inevitable future of American transportation. The car body was dramatically lighter than steel because its panels were made from plant fiber measured to be stronger than metal in laboratory impact tests. The fuel burned cleaner than gasoline because it combusted without the toxic emissions that petroleum products inevitably produce. The entire vehicle, from body to fuel tank, represented complete and total independence from the oil industry that was already methodically tightening its strangling grip on American infrastructure and transportation. Then this extraordinary plant was banned by federal law. The revolutionary car disappeared almost entirely from public memory and historical awareness. Henry Ford's transformative vision was buried so completely and so systematically that most Americans today have never heard this remarkable story. Despite it being thoroughly documented in searchable newspaper archives from that era, the plant was banned a second time 3 decades later, just as environmental consciousness was rising and alternatives to petroleum were gaining public interest. The timing was not coincidental. Every time this plant threatened oil industry profits, legislation appeared to criminalize it. This plant grows in ditches. It grows on roadsides. It grows in soil to pour for food crops. It requires no irrigation in most climates. It produces more biomass per acre than any other plant cultivated in temperate regions. It matures in 4 months, allowing multiple harvests in long-growing seasons. The petroleum industry generates over $4 trillion annually. Every car running on plant fuel represents revenue lost. Every farmer growing fuel crops represents independence from oil infrastructure. Every acre converted from dependence to self-sufficiency represents a crack in the foundation of the most profitable industry in human history. This plant is hemp, Cannabis sativa, grown for fiber and fuel rather than intoxication. The plant so threatening to corporate profits that it required two separate prohibition campaigns spanning 8 decades. In the next 14 minutes, everything the petroleum industry has varied since 1937. The real reason hemp was criminalized, the exposed. The exposed Henry Ford built and the oil companies destroyed. The simple economics that prove hemp fuel could replace gasoline tomorrow, and the 2018 law that made growing this plant legal again after 8 decades of suppression. 1 plant, 2 bans, for a $1 trillion industry running scared. The file is open. There is a scientific reality about hemp fuel that petroleum companies have spent billions to obscure. Hemp produces oil from its seeds that converts directly into biodiesel through a simple chemical process called transestrification. The process requires only hemp seed oil, an alcohol like methanol, and a catalyst like lye. Farmers with basic equipment can produce fuel on their own property from crops they grow themselves. Hemp biodiesel contains no sulfur. Petroleum diesel contains sulfur that produces acid rain and respiratory disease. Hemp biodiesel is biodegradable. Petroleum spills contaminate ecosystems for decades. Hemp biodiesel is carbon neutral because the plants absorb carbon dioxide while growing. Petroleum releases carbon sequestered underground for millions of years. Research published in the journal Fuel documented hemp biodiesel performance comparable to petroleum diesel across all standard metrics. Engine power, fuel efficiency, and operational temperature all fell within acceptable ranges. The research confirmed what Ford demonstrated 80 years earlier. The University of Connecticut conducted research on hemp biodiesel efficiency in 2010. Their findings showed 97% conversion efficiency from hemp seed oil to usable fuel. This efficiency exceeded most other biodiesel feedstocks, including soybean and canola. The scientific case for hemp fuel is not controversial among researchers. The controversy is entirely manufactured by industries that profit from petroleum dependence. The research exists. The technology exists. The suppression exists because the economics threaten the wrong people. There is a history to hemp fuel that predates the petroleum industry entirely and reveals what was deliberately stolen from farmers worldwide. Rudolf Diesel, the brilliant German inventor of the diesel engine, specifically designed his revolutionary engine to run on vegetable oils rather than petroleum products. The first public demonstration of the diesel engine at the 1900 World S Fair in Paris used peanut oil as fuel to the astonishment of attendees. Diesel explicitly and repeatedly envisioned farmers across the world growing their own fuel and achieving complete energy independence from centralized corporate suppliers who would inevitably exploit their dependence. Diesel wrote about his liberating vision extensively in letters, papers, and public speeches throughout his career. He saw the diesel engine as true liberation technology that would permanently free farmers from purchasing fuel from corporate monopolies. He passionately imagined decentralized energy production systems that kept wealth circulating in rural communities rather than concentrating it relentlessly in the hands of oil barons building fortunes from the labor of others. Rudolf Diesel died under deeply mysterious circumstances in September 1913 that have never been adequately explained. He disappeared from a ship crossing the English Channel during the night. His body was recovered by fishermen weeks later in an advanced state of decomposition. The death was officially ruled suicide, but many historians and investigators have seriously questioned this convenient conclusion. Diesel was traveling to London specifically to meet with representatives of the British Admiralty about engines that could run on vegetable oil rather than petroleum, freeing naval vessels from dependence on oil companies. Within years of Diesel's death, the petroleum industry had captured the engine he invented. Standard Oil and its competitors ensured that petroleum diesel became the standard fuel. The vegetable oil compatibility that Diesel had championed was engineered out of subsequent engine designs. Henry Ford understood what had happened. His hemp car project was explicitly designed to restore the energy independence that Diesel had envisioned and petroleum companies had stolen. Ford saw hemp as the solution because it produced more oil per acre than peanuts or any other available crop. Ford's vision died with prohibition. The 1937 Marijuana Tax Act made hemp cultivation effectively impossible regardless of the crop's THC content. The fuel that could have freed American farmers was criminalized to protect the industries that profited from their dependence. There is a well-documented conspiracy behind the 1937 prohibition that historians have exposed extensively through primary source research. Andrew Mellon served as Treasury Secretary under 3 consecutive American presidents from 1921 to 1932. He was simultaneously the primary financial backer and major stakeholder of DuPont Chemical Company, creating an obvious conflict of interest that was ignored entirely. When Mellon personally appointed Harry Anslinger to lead the newly created Federal Bureau of Narcotics in 1930, he strategically installed a man who would spend the next 3 decades crusading relentlessly against hemp with missionary zeal. DuPont had recently patented highly profitable processes for making plastics and synthetic textiles from petroleum products. Natural hemp fiber directly competed with these patented petroleum-based products in multiple markets. Hemp plastics were naturally biodegradable and required absolutely no DuPont patents or licensing fees. DuPont's entire corporate business strategy and stock valuation depended completely on eliminating this natural competition that they could not control or profit from. William Randolph Hearst owned newspapers across America and massive timber holdings that supplied paper pulp. Hemp produces 4 times more paper pulp per acre than timber and matures in months rather than decades. Hearst's newspapers ran sensationalized stories about marijuana while his timber investments faced obsolescence from hemp competition. The Hearst newspapers never distinguished between industrial hemp and intoxicating marijuana varieties. The propaganda deliberately conflated a fiber crop with drug use to turn public opinion against all cannabis cultivation. The lies were systematic and coordinated across his media empire. The 1937 Marijuana Tax Act did not technically ban hemp. It imposed taxes and regulations so burdensome that legal cultivation became impossible. The few farmers who attempted compliance found themselves entangled in bureaucratic requirements designed to be insurmountable. The American Medical Association opposed the act, noting that cannabis had legitimate medical applications being destroyed by the legislation. Their objections were ignored. The petroleum and chemical industries had purchased the outcome they required. There is a second prohibition that crushed hemp revival, just as environmental consciousness was emerging. The 1970 Controlled Substances Act classified all cannabis as Schedule I, regardless of THC content. Industrial hemp, with no intoxicating properties whatsoever, was legally equivalent to the most potent marijuana. Growing rope became legally identical to manufacturing drugs. The timing aligned precisely with rising environmental awareness. The first Earth Day occurred in 1970. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring had awakened millions to ecological destruction. Alternative fuels and sustainable materials were entering public discussion. Hemp offered solutions to environmental concerns that were gaining political traction. The 1970 prohibition ensured that those solutions remained illegal precisely as demand for them accelerated. The oil industry had learned from the close call with Ford's hemp car and ensured no repeat would be possible. President Nixon commissioned a study on marijuana that recommended decriminalization. He ignored his own commission's findings and proceeded with the harshest possible classification. Nixon's domestic policy advisor, John Ehrlichman, later admitted that drug policy was designed to target political enemies rather than address genuine public health concerns. The industrial hemp distinction was deliberately ignored in the Controlled Substances Act. Legislators understood that fiber hemp could not intoxicate anyone. They classified it identically to drug varieties regardless, because the same financial interests controlled the legislative process in 1970 that had controlled it in 1937. The Schedule I classification created barriers beyond simple prohibition. Research became nearly impossible. Universities could not study hemp without navigating bureaucratic obstacles designed to prevent exactly such research. The knowledge suppression was as important as the cultivation ban. There is an economic comparison between hemp fuel and petroleum that explains the intensity of suppression. 1 acre of hemp produces between 300 and 1,000 gallons of biodiesel depending on variety and growing conditions. The United States contains over 900 million acres of farmland. Even dedicating a small percentage to hemp fuel would produce billions of gallons annually. Petroleum extraction requires drilling operations costing millions of dollars. Hemp cultivation requires seeds, soil, and sunlight. The capital requirements for petroleum create barriers that exclude small producers and concentrate wealth among corporations large enough to afford extraction infrastructure. Hemp grows in 4 months from seed to harvest. A new oil field takes years to develop and begin producing. The responsiveness of hemp production to demand changes vastly exceeds petroleum supply flexibility. Farmers could scale production up or down seasonally, while oil companies struggle to adjust output. Transportation costs for petroleum require pipelines, tanker ships, and rail networks spanning continents. Hemp fuel can be produced locally from locally grown crops. The distributed production model eliminates the infrastructure that petroleum companies control and profit from. The labor economics favor hemp dramatically. Growing and processing hemp creates agricultural and manufacturing jobs distributed across rural communities. Petroleum extraction concentrates employment at drilling sites and refineries that employ relatively few workers for the revenue generated. The $4 trillion petroleum industry understands these economics perfectly. Every analysis confirms that widespread hemp cultivation would fundamentally restructure energy markets against their interests. The suppression was never about drug policy. The suppression was always about protecting the most profitable industry on earth. There is a legal transformation that occurred in 2018 that changed everything. The Agriculture Improvement Act of 2018, commonly known as the Farm Bill, removed industrial hemp from the Controlled Substances Act. Hemp containing less than 0.3% THC became legal to cultivate for the first time in over 80 years. The second prohibition ended with a signature. Farmers across America immediately began planting hemp. Acreage expanded from 0 to over 500,000 acres within 3 years. Processing infrastructure started developing. State programs emerged to regulate cultivation and verify THC compliance. The hemp fuel industry remains in early development despite legalization. The processing infrastructure that prohibition prevented for decades cannot materialize instantly. Investment is flowing, but facilities take years to build. The petroleum industry had 80 years to entrench. Hemp is starting from suppression. Research institutions finally have freedom to study hemp fuel without bureaucratic persecution. Universities are publishing findings that confirm what Ford demonstrated in 1941, that scientific literature suppressed for generations is finally being written. The petroleum industry has not surrendered. Lobbying continues to restrict hemp applications and slow infrastructure development. Regulatory barriers replace outright prohibition. The tactics evolved, but the goal remains preventing hemp from reaching its potential. The 2018 legalization cracked the door open. Whether hemp fuel actually displaces petroleum depends on whether enough farmers plant it, enough investors fund processing facilities, and enough consumers demand alternatives to corporate petroleum dependence. There is a cultivation simplicity to hemp that threatens centralized energy control. Hemp grows without irrigation in most temperate climates. Rainfall provides sufficient water. The deep taproot accesses moisture that shallow-rooted crops cannot reach. Drought tolerance reduces crop failure risk and eliminates irrigation infrastructure costs. Hemp requires no pesticides under normal growing conditions. The dense canopy shades out competing weeds naturally. Natural pest resistance reduces input costs and environmental contamination. The plant thrives through its own biological defenses. Hemp improves soil rather than depleting it. The deep roots break compacted soil layers and improve drainage. Fallen leaves add organic matter. The plant can remediate contaminated soil by absorbing heavy metals and toxins. Fields improve after hemp cultivation rather than requiring recovery. The growth rate is extraordinary. Hemp reaches 12 to 15 feet in 4 months under good conditions. The biomass production per acre exceeds any other temperate climate crop. More fuel feedstock per acre means more energy independence per farm. Seeds are the only significant input cost. A farmer with saved seeds from previous harvests eliminates even this expense. The self-sufficiency potential is total. A farm could theoretically produce its own fuel indefinitely with zero external purchases once initial seed stock is established. This independence is precisely what the petroleum industry cannot tolerate. Their entire business model depends on customers who must purchase fuel continuously. A farmer producing fuel from crops eliminates a customer permanently. Scale that independence across millions of farms and the industry collapses. There is a future available that the petroleum industry is desperately fighting to prevent. Imagine rural communities producing fuel from crops grown on marginal land unsuitable for food production. Imagine farmers selling surplus fuel to neighbors rather than purchasing from distant corporations. Imagine energy dollars circulating locally rather than flowing to multinational oil companies. Imagine mechanics converting vehicles to run on plant-based fuel produced within miles of where it is used. Imagine the $4 trillion petroleum industry shrinking as customers discover they no longer need its products. Imagine the political power derived from oil wealth dissolving as energy production democratizes. This future requires no technological breakthroughs. The conversion processes exist. The cultivation knowledge exists. The vehicles can be modified with existing technology. Everything needed to replace petroleum dependence is available today. The only barrier is the continuation of policies designed to protect petroleum profits. The lobbying, the regulatory obstacles, the deliberate infrastructure delays all serve one purpose. They buy time for an industry that knows its dominance cannot survive genuine competition. From distributed plant-based fuel production, the 2018 Farm Bill removed the primary legal barrier to hemp cultivation. The remaining barriers are purely economic and political rather than legal. Overcoming them requires farmers actively planting hemp, investors courageously funding processing facilities, consumers loudly demanding alternatives, and citizens finally recognizing that 8 full decades of prohibition served corporate financial interests exclusively rather than any legitimate public welfare concern. One plant banned twice across 8 decades specifically to protect $4 trillion in annual petroleum revenue from natural competition. One plant that grows wild in ditches and abandoned roadsides and produces fuel demonstrably cleaner than gasoline. One plant that Henry Ford championed publicly before coordinated corporate power systematically buried his revolutionary vision, along with Rudolph Diesel's original liberating dream of worldwide farmer energy independence. The file is now completely open. The choice between continued petroleum dependence and plant-based energy independence belongs to everyone willing. To act on this suppressed information, subscribe now and hit the bell to see what other revolutionary solutions are waiting. While powerful industries profit from ruthlessly suppressing alternatives that actually work,